It just didn't feel like the same. It just didn't feel like it felt to me a little bit jaded.
Chris Norman is a familiar face to millions, the unmistakable voice behind Smokie, a symbol of 1970s pop rock. But at the height of his success, he decided to leave the band after 15 years. That choice left many fans stunned and deeply saddened. People could not understand why Chris Norman would walk away from the band that made him a star. Now, for the first time, Chris Norman speaks openly about the Smokie, and he no longer supports Smokie today. Smokie began in 1964 when Chris Norman formed a band with his school friends Alan Silson and Terry Utley. At that stage, they were not building a polished pop act, and they were not chasing an image designed for radio. They were a hard-working young rock band that played with force, relied on strong vocal harmonies, and built its identity through live performance rather than publicity. Before the name Smokie became fixed, the group went through other names, including Smokie, and only later adopted the spelling Smokie in order to avoid confusion with Smokey Robinson. During the second half of the 1960s and into the early 1970s, the band lived a difficult touring life across Britain. They traveled in a van, carried their own equipment, and moved constantly from one small job to the next. Their venues were not major theaters or television studios, but pubs, clubs, and local halls where the audience stood close to the stage and judged the band immediately. There was very little comfort in this period. Money was uncertain, fees were low, and there was no promise that the work would lead anywhere. On some trips, the band slept on rolled mattresses and accepted conditions that would have driven many others to quit. What kept them going was not security, because they had none, but the feeling that they were building something together. These years created the bond that later defined the group. Norman, Silson, and Utley worked side by side under the same pressure, and that pressure forced them to become tighter musicians. Night after night, they learned how to sing in close harmony, how to keep the energy high in a difficult room, and how to hold an audience even when the stage, the sound system, and the payment were all poor. They did not have the luxury of wasting performances. Every set had to count, because every set could determine whether they were invited back. Chris Norman later described this period as an adventure, and the word fits because the years before fame were not glamorous, but formative. The band was learning its character in public, often under hard conditions, and those conditions shaped both its sound and its discipline. The rough travel, the small venues, and the repeated performances gave them a working method that stayed with them after success arrived. By the early 1970s, they were still not stars, but they had something more important than early publicity. They had experience, endurance, and a shared musical instinct that had been tested in real conditions over many years. This foundation mattered because Smokie's later success did not appear suddenly from nowhere. It grew out of a long period in which the band learned how to function as a unit. Their vocal blend became sharper, their stage presence became stronger, and Norman's distinctive voice began to take a clearer central role within the group's sound. The hard years on the road did not make them famous, but they made them ready. In Norman's view, this was the stage that truly formed Smokie, because before the hit records, before television, and before international touring, there was a young band in a van learning how to survive, how to perform, and how to sound like itself. Smokie's breakthrough came in the mid-1970s after they began working with producers Nicky Chinn and Mike Chapman, a partnership that changed both their sound and their commercial direction. This collaboration led directly to a series of hit records, starting with If You Think You Know How to Love Me in 1975, followed by Living Next Door to Alice in 1976, and Lay Back in the Arms of Someone shortly after. The band moved from small venues to large halls and international stages. They toured extensively across continental Europe, Scandinavia, and Australia. building a strong fan base outside the UK. Their presence on television also increased significantly, with more than 40 appearances on Top of the Pops. Each appearance reinforced their visibility and expanded their audience. Their success was built on a clear musical formula that worked well in the market at the time. Chris Norman's distinctive raspy voice provided an emotional center. While the band's tight vocal harmonies added structure and depth, the sound blended elements of glam rock and soft rock, which appealed strongly to European audiences in the 1970s. This combination made their songs accessible, memorable, and easy to broadcast across different countries. Sales reflected this impact. Their records sold in the millions, and their songs became regular features on radio playlists. Smokie developed a loyal international following, particularly in Germany, Scandinavia, and Australia, where their popularity often exceeded that in their home country. Concert attendance grew, and the band became a reliable draw in multiple markets. However, the success brought a demanding schedule that left little room for variation. The band followed a repeated cycle: recording sessions, television appearances, and continuous touring. This cycle operated at a high pace and required constant output. Each new release was expected to match the previous success, and this expectation limited experimentation. For Chris Norman, it created a growing tension. While the band was achieving strong commercial results, he began to feel constrained by the consistency of the formula. The producers, the label, and the market all favored a specific sound that had already proven successful. Deviating from that sound carried financial risk, and the system did not encourage it. The pressure was not based on conflict within the band, but on the structure surrounding it. The schedule reduced time for creative exploration, and the demand for predictable results shaped the music. Norman continued to perform and record at a high level, but over time he became more aware that his role was becoming fixed within a narrow range. By the late 1970s, Smokie had reached a stable peak. They had international recognition, strong sales, and consistent media presence. At the same time, the conditions that supported their success also began to define its limits. The same system that built their popularity also restricted change. And this contradiction would later influence Norman's decision to leave. This phase represents both the highest point of Smokie's commercial career and the beginning of a shift in perspective for its lead singer. The achievements were clear and measurable, but so were the constraints. The band had reached a position where maintaining success required repetition. And for Norman, repetition gradually became a problem that could not be ignored. In 1986, Chris Norman made a decision that many people did not expect. After more than 20 years with the band, he left Smokie at a time when the group still had recognition, a stable audience, and a working commercial model. There was no public conflict between members, and there was no sudden collapse in popularity. The decision came from a different source: his growing dissatisfaction with creative limitations. Norman described this step as one of the biggest risks of his life. By leaving Smokie, he gave up a secure position. The band had an established fan base across Europe, regular touring opportunities, and a recognizable identity. The core issue was repetition. The band had developed a formula that worked, and the industry around them expected that formula to continue. New songs were shaped to match previous successes. Recording sessions followed similar structures. Touring schedules remained dense. Over time, Norman felt that his role had become fixed. He could perform effectively, but he had less space to explore new directions. The decision to leave required a clear trade-off. He accepted that he would lose immediate recognition as part of a group and would need to rebuild his identity as a solo artist. He also understood that he could not completely separate himself from Smokie. His voice had defined the band's sound, and audiences would continue to associate him with that period. The transition phase was not simple. Moving from a group to a solo career meant taking control of artistic decisions while also managing the risks alone. there was no shared responsibility within a band structure. Every outcome, whether successful or not, would be directly linked to him. Despite these challenges, Norman achieved early solo success. In 1986, the same year he left Smokie, he released Midnight Lady, which reached #1 in Germany and performed strongly in several European markets. This result demonstrated that his voice remained a key factor in attracting listeners. It also confirmed that he could operate outside the band context. At the same time, the success did not eliminate the complexity of his position. He had to balance two realities. On one side, his past with Smokie remained highly visible. On the other side, he needed to develop new material that could stand independently. This balance required consistent effort over time. Norman compared this situation to other artists who left successful groups, including Paul McCartney and the Bee Gees in different phases of their careers. In each case, previous success created both an advantage and a constraint. It provided recognition and an existing audience, but it also created expectations that could limit change. For Norman, the key was not to reject the past, but to manage it. He did not attempt to erase Smokie from his identity. Instead, he worked to build a continuation that included both his earlier work and new material. This approach allowed him to maintain connection with audiences while still moving forward. The decision in 1986 marked a clear shift from collective success to individual responsibility. It involved financial risk, creative uncertainty, and the need to rebuild structure from the ground up. However, it also gave Norman control over his direction, which had been the main factor behind the decision. Looking back, the move can be understood as a response to long-term pressure rather than a sudden change. The conditions that led to his departure had developed gradually during the late 1970s and early 1980s. By 1986, leaving was not a reaction, but a conclusion. After leaving Smokie in 1986, Chris Norman initially tried to distance himself from the band's earlier material. In the first phase of his solo career, he focused on building a separate identity through new songs and new recordings. He avoided performing too many Smokie hits on stage because he wanted audiences to recognize him as an independent artist, rather than only as the former lead singer of a successful group. This approach did not last. Over time, Norman observed a clear pattern during concerts. Audiences responded strongly when familiar Smokie songs were included in the setlist. These reactions were consistent across different countries and different generations of listeners. The songs carried recognition that new material could not immediately replace. Norman adjusted his strategy. Instead of avoiding the past, he began to integrate it into his performances. His concerts developed a balanced structure that combined three elements: classic Smokie songs, his solo hits, and newer material. This structure allowed him to maintain continuity while also presenting ongoing work. Performing Smokie songs again served a practical purpose. It created an immediate connection with the audience. Listeners who had followed the band in the 1970s recognized the songs from earlier periods of their lives. At the same time, younger listeners were introduced to these tracks through live performance. This combination expanded the audience rather than limiting it. Norman did not treat these songs as separate from his current work. He considered them part of a continuous career. The same voice that recorded the original versions was still present, and this consistency reinforced authenticity during live shows. When he performed Living Next Door to Alice, or If You Think You Know How to Love Me, the delivery remained directly linked to the original recordings. He no longer saw the Smokie catalog as something that restricted him. Instead, he viewed it as a foundation that supported his ongoing work. The earlier songs did not prevent new creativity. They made it easier to present it. Live performance became the main space where this integration was visible. Each concert followed a structured flow. Recognizable songs appeared at key moments to maintain engagement, while newer tracks were placed in between to extend the narrative. This method allowed him to manage audience expectations without repeating the same set entirely. Over time, Smokey's music took on an additional role. It became a link between different age groups. Older listeners associated the songs with the 1970s, while newer audiences encountered them in a live context. In 2021, Terry Utley, the last remaining original member of Smokie, passed away after his death. The band continued to perform under the name Smokie, with a completely new lineup. None of the musicians in the current group were part of the original formation or the classic recording period of the 1970s. Chris Norman addressed this situation directly and without ambiguity. He stated clearly, "I do not support it in any way. I have no connection with the band that is now called Smokie." This statement defines his position. It is not partial. It is not conditional. It is a complete separation. The reason behind this position is based on authorship and identity. Norman links the Smokie legacy to the original members who created the sound, recorded the hit songs, and built the audience during the 1970s. He does not focus on criticizing individual musicians in the current lineup. He does not question their ability or professionalism. Instead, he focuses on the use of the name. In his view, continuing under the same name without any original members creates confusion for audiences who may assume continuity where it does not exist. Norman acknowledges that this situation is not unique. Similar cases exist across the music industry, where bands continue with new members long after the original lineup has disappeared, in many cases. The name functions as a commercial brand that carries recognition and attracts audiences. He recognizes this as a common practice, but he does not align himself with it. His position remains consistent. The authentic Smokie is defined by the period in which the original members created and recorded their music. That period is primarily the 1970s, when the band established its sound and achieved its major successes. Later formations, regardless of quality, do not represent that original identity. At the same time, Norman does not deny that the music continues to reach new audiences. The songs are still performed. They are still heard in concerts. New listeners are introduced to the catalog. He accepts this outcome as part of how music circulates over time. However, he separates two things clearly: the continued performance of the songs and the ownership of the legacy. The songs can be played by others, but the origin of those songs remains fixed. For him, the legacy belongs to the creators, not to the name alone. This distinction shapes how he presents his own work. When he performs Smokie songs, he does so as one of the original voices that defined them. His connection is direct and historical. It is based on participation in the recording and creation process, not on later continuation. Norman's position is not driven by nostalgia. It is based on a specific definition of authenticity. The identity of Smokie, in his view, is tied to the people who built it, not to the ongoing use of its name.